Welcome, kind traveler, to another gentle step back into history. Tonight, we're re-slipping into a world that feels both familiar in its humanity and distant in its setting. Perhaps you're listening as your mind begins to quiet after a long day. Or maybe you're already drifting with heavy eyelids, half in dreams. However you arrived here, I'm grateful you chose to share this time. I'd also love to know where in the world you're listening from, and what hour greets you right now. There is something heartwarming about the thought of this quiet story reaching so many corners of the globe. And if these soft journeys through the past help you find calm, don't forget to follow along. There are countless, peaceful nights ahead of us. When we think of the Salem Witch Trials, most of us picture a simple tale. A handful of young girls accusing townsfolk of witchcraft, panic spreading like wildfire, and innocent lives lost before reason finally returned. It's often framed as a warning about superstition overcoming logic, but that tidy version barely scratches the surface. The real story of Salem Village and the neighboring communities was far darker, far more tangled, and far more revealing about human nature than most people ever realize. What happened in Salem wasn't just a matter of strict religion or young girls craving attention. It was a storm born of social unrest, economic rivalries, personal grudges, and deliberate manipulation. Together, these forces created a merciless machine of fear and accusation, one endorsed by the very institutions meant to protect the innocent. Tonight, we'll look why the Salem Witch Trials were far worse than you've likely imagined. We'll uncover the deliberate cruelty of the examinations, the carefully staged evidence, and the way the courts themselves became tools of destruction. We'll meet real people whose names still echo through history, and through their stories, we'll see how a community lost its moral anchor. Most unsettling of all, though, is this. The forces that drove Salem's tragedy didn't disappear with time. The same social pressures and psychological tricks that turned neighbors into executioners still linger beneath the surface of our modern, civilized world. It all began in the bitter winter of 1692. 9-year-old Elizabeth Parris and her cousin, 11-year-old Abigail Williams' daughter and niece of Salem's minister, Samuel Parris, started displaying mysterious symptoms. According to their doctor, these were the work of supernatural forces. The girls screamed uncontrollably, writhed on the ground, bent their bodies into unnatural shapes, and insisted they saw shadowy figures tormenting them. What most accounts leave out is that these strange episodes weren't entirely random. The girls had been dabbling in folk magic, hoping to glimpse their future husbands by dropping an egg white into a glass of water, a form of fortune-telling. But something went wrong. Perhaps the shapes in the water frightened them, or the ritual itself left them unsettled. Whatever the cause, they were caught in a dangerous dilemma. Such practices were strictly forbidden in their Puritan community. Admitting their experiments could bring harsh punishment. So instead of confessing, they shifted the blame. They began claiming they were under attack by witches, transforming themselves from guilty participants into pitiable victims in need of protection. This calculated choice would set in motion a chain of events that cost 20 lives. The first 3 women accused were not chosen at random. Tituba, an enslaved woman from the Caribbean living in the Parris household, had likely shown the girls some of the folk rituals they had attempted. Sarah Good was a destitute beggar who often went door to door, pleading for food. Easy prey for a society that equated poverty with sin. Sarah Osborne was an older woman already whispered about in town for defying social norms. She had lived with a man before marriage and she was embroiled in bitter disputes over her late husband's estate. Notice the pattern. The accusations did not target respected leaders or wealthy neighbors. They struck at those with no protection, no power, and no defenders: a slave, a beggar, and an outcast. These women were society's easiest scapegoats. Once the 3 were arrested, the machinery of injustice began turning. The courts, rather than safeguarding fairness, became tools for producing guilt. Interrogations were not about uncovering truth, but about staging a performance that forced confessions. Presiding magistrates, John Hawthorne and Jonathan Corwin, entered the hearings already convinced of guilt. Their role was not to judge, but to extract names and confessions by whatever means necessary. Their questioning followed a predictable rhythm. Suggestive questions, intimidation, promises of leniency in exchange for cooperation. All the while, the afflicted girls shrieked, collapsed, and writhed dramatically whenever an accused woman dared deny the charges, creating a terrifying atmosphere where denial itself was treated as proof. The most chilling aspect was this cruel paradox. If you confessed to witchcraft, you might live, but only if you accused others. If you denied the charges, you sealed your fate. These numbers, as grim as they are, only begin to reveal the true scale of the terror that consumed Salem. The torment inflicted on the accused stretched far beyond the hangman's noose. For many, the ordeal began the moment they were arrested, chained in filthy, overcrowded jails where illness spread unchecked and food was scarce. Families were forced to shoulder the crushing expense of imprisonment, often driving them into ruin while they desperately tried to support loved ones wasting away behind bars. Some never made it to trial at all. They died in the darkness of the cells, victims of the witch panic every bit as much as those who perished on the gallows. The executions themselves were staged as public theater, carefully orchestrated to reaffirm the colony's sense of righteousness. Yet in these moments of cruelty, the condemned often displayed more courage, grace, and conviction than their judges or accusers. Many proclaimed their innocence to their final breath, forgiving those who wronged them and praying for their persecutors. Their last words laid bare the injustice of the trials and exposed the moral collapse of the society that condemned them. What makes Salem more horrifying than most realize is not only the brutality of its punishments or the number of lives taken. It is how the entire community, neighbors, leaders, institutions became entangled in a machinery of death disguised as justice. Systems designed to defend the innocent were twisted into weapons. People who thought themselves civilized were swept into bloodlust, transformed into a mob eager to destroy. The Salem Witch Trials hold up a mirror to human nature, and what it shows us is unsettling. They reveal how fear can be sharpened into a weapon, how authority can bend truth, and how quickly an orderly society can spiral into chaos when gripped by hysteria. The lesson is chilling. The seeds of such cruelty are not locked in the distant past. They still live within us, waiting for the right storm of fear and power to awaken them. As we move deeper into this story, we'll see that the legal foundations of the trials crumbled into absurdity. The so-called evidence used to condemn people reveals how thoroughly Salem's courts abandoned reason. At the center of it all was spectral evidence, a claim that someone, a spirit or ghost, could appear in dreams or visions and torment the living. Imagine that. A dream could become a death sentence. Judges, led by figures like William Stoughton, didn't just allow this, they encouraged it, praising those who delivered wild accusations as though they were warriors in a holy battle. Children who accused their neighbors were called brave. Adults who confessed to impossible crimes were spared, while those who insisted on their innocence faced the rope. The trials became a kind of grotesque stage play. In the courtroom, the afflicted girls would convulse, scream, and collapse, crying out that the accused were pinching them or stabbing them with invisible needles. If the accused so much as shifted a hand, the girls would mimic the movement, claiming they were being forced to copy it. The room would erupt with gasps, as the judges nodded gravely, treating these outbursts as undeniable proof of witchcraft. What makes it even more chilling is that these performances weren't random, they were coordinated. The girls had discovered that by playing their roles convincingly, they gained extraordinary power in a society that normally silenced them. With a single scream and a pointed finger, they could destroy anyone they wished. And instead of protecting the innocent, the colony's leaders fed this frenzy, encouraging it to grow. Justice moved at terrifying speed. Once accused, a person had almost no chance to prepare a defense. Bridget Bishop, the first to be executed, went from accusation to hanging in less than 2 months. Others were condemned even faster. The court operated like a relentless machine, churning through cases with ruthless efficiency. Its goal, not truth, but spectacle. And the targets were not random. Beneath the religious rhetoric lay deep prejudices and personal vendettas. Women who challenged Puritan ideals, who dared to be outspoken or unconventional, were marked as threats. Sarah Gould, poor and homeless, was despised for muttering curses when refused help. Sarah Osborne was punished for living with a man outside marriage, a sin too great to ignore. These accusations were not about witchcraft at all, they were character assassinations, cloaked in the language of piety. The economic motives become clearer still when you look at what happened to the accused. The moment someone was charged with witchcraft, their property was seized and frozen. If a person was executed, their property was automatically seized by the colony. In an instant, the witch trials became more than a crusade against imagined evil. They turned into a tool for stripping wealth and redistributing land. Neighbors who had battled over boundaries or inheritance suddenly had the perfect weapon to destroy their rivals. What unfolded was not just religious hysteria, but one of the largest coerced transfers of wealth in early Massachusetts. Take the case of George Jacobs Sr., a prosperous farmer who had accumulated substantial property over his lifetime. His own granddaughter accused him of witchcraft, but only after he refused to hand over his land to other relatives. Within months, Jacobs was hanged, and the land he had worked so hard to secure was parceled out among those who had testified against him. That was not divine justice. It was legalized plunder, sanctified under the banner of faith. The leaders of the colony understood this dynamic well. Governor William Phipps initially threw his support behind the trials, but when accusations touched his own household, his wife was named as a witch. He suddenly discovered that spectral evidence was unreliable. It wasn't God's mercy that halted the machinery of death. It was politics. When the accusations climbed high enough up the social ladder, the entire system began to collapse under its own contradictions. The aftermath laid bare the most damning truth of all. Once the panicked, there was no thorough investigation, no honest accounting of how neighbors had condemned neighbors, or how institutions had been corrupted. Instead, there was a collective effort to forget. The community chose to see itself as a victim of Satan's deception, rather than acknowledging its own complicity. A few apologies trickled out years later, but they were hollow and self-serving. Judge Samuel Sewell admitted his role, but only when it was safe to do so. Most of the accusers, including Ann Putnam Jr., whose testimony had condemned dozens, faced no real consequences. Years afterward, she issued a half-hearted apology, claiming she had been misled by the devil. Yet she lived out her life untouched by punishment, while her victims lay buried. This refusal to reckon with the truth reveals the darkest element of Salem. It wasn't just superstition or it was a community willing to sacrifice the vulnerable in order to protect the powerful. It was about how quickly an ordinary society can transform into a mob. Once authority figures grant permission for violence in the name of righteousness, the witch trials were not some strange aberration locked in the 1600s. They were a warning of how fragile justice becomes when fear takes the reins, when accusation replaces evidence, and when those in power learn to bend mass hysteria to their advantage. The most frightening thing about Salem is not that it happened centuries ago. It's that the same conditions could ignite again in any time or place. And perhaps the most chilling element of all wasn't even the property seizures or the reliance on dreams as evidence. It was the systematic dismantling of justice itself, piece by piece, safeguard by safeguard, until the trials were nothing more than a grotesque performance with the verdict already decided. Picture yourself in that courtroom in 1692. The air heavy with dread, eyes fixed on you as whispers ripple through the crowd. You know you are innocent. Yet you also know, with absolute certainty, that innocence offers no protection here. What stands before you is not a fair trial, it is an execution dressed in legal robes. The Salem proceedings represent one of the most complete distortions of justice in American history. Every protection that should have shielded the accused was ignored, inverted, or turned into a weapon against them. And the most terrifying realization is that those orchestrating the trials knew exactly what they were doing. Consider the most basic safeguard of all: the burden of proof. In any fair system, guilt must be demonstrated beyond reasonable doubt by the accusers. In Salem, this principle was reversed. The accused had to prove their innocence, an impossible task. How does one prove they have not flown in the night, that they have not sent a phantom to pinch or stab someone in their sleep, that they have not whispered a secret pact with the devil when no one was watching? The answer, of course, is that you can't. And that was precisely the trap. Deny the charges. That is exactly what a witch would say. Confess. Then you are guilty. Offer an alibi. Your spirit could travel without your body. Present? Character witnesses? They were liars or witches themselves. Every avenue led to the same end. Guilt. Sarah, good experienced this nightmare firsthand. When Magistrate John Hawthorne demanded she admit to tormenting children, she refused, insisting on her innocence. His response was a masterpiece of circular reasoning. "Do you not see what you have done? Why will you not confess the truth? Why do you continue to torment these poor children?" When she held her ground and replied simply, "I employ nobody," Hawthorne twisted her words into proof of guilt. If she wasn't using anyone else to carry out the torment, then clearly she must be doing it herself. This was not incompetence. It was deliberate. The magistrates had abandoned the search for truth long before the first gavel struck. They had already decided who was guilty. The trials were never about Justice Day War theater, staged to justify the deaths that had been planned in advance. The corruption of the Salem courts went far beyond simply flipping the burden of proof onto the accused. What made the trials truly horrifying was how completely the legal standards for evidence were abandoned. In any genuine court of law, evidence must be credible, testable, and grounded in reality. But in Salem, the judges were willing to accept the most irrational, unverifiable, and fantastical claims as absolute truth. Dreams were transformed into testimony. Hallucinations and visions were paraded as eyewitness accounts. And most shockingly, so-called spectral evidence. Accusations that someone, as ghostly double or spirit had harmed another person became the very backbone of the prosecution's case. Think about just how absurd this really was. Imagine if modern trials functioned the same way. "Your Honor, I dreamt last night that the defendant robbed a bank, and wheat that the gavel comes down guilty. Sentenced. Case closed." But in Salem, this nightmare logic wasn't just tolerated, it was encouraged. When the group of afflicted girls would collapse into fits inside the courtrooms, writhing and pointing at invisible attackers, the magistrates didn't dismiss it as hysteria. Instead, they leaned into the performance, treating it as proof. They demanded the girls describe what they saw, then turned to the accused and asked them to explain why their spirit was tormenting these children. They even commanded defendants to call back their specters, as if this theater of imagination were a reasonable and lawful process. Take Bridget Bishop's trial as an example. The girls insisted her ghostly form was choking and pinching them right there in the courtroom. Instead of questioning the absurdity of such a claim, Magistrate John Hawthorne pressed Bishop with bizarre accusations. "Why do you seem to act witchcraft before us? By the motion of your body." When Bishop denied it, Hawthorne doubled down, asking, "Is it not your coat that hurts them?" "Your coat?" Yes, they were seriously suggesting that a simple piece of clothing was carrying out violent assaults through supernatural means. And disturbingly, this wasn't treated as comic nonsense. It was accepted as valid evidence in a capital trial where a person's life hung in the balance. Defendants weren't even granted the dignity of a proper defense. When they tried to speak, they were shouted down. If they dared to challenge the credibility of their accusers, they were chastised for insulting innocent victims. And when they pointed out glaring contradictions or impossibilities in the charges, they were condemned as argumentative troublemakers. Martha Corey discovered this firsthand. Before she was accused herself, she openly questioned whether the afflicted girls might simply be lying or mistaken. Later, that same skepticism was twisted into proof of her guilt. After all, who but a witch would dare cast doubt on the holy work of a witch trial? The entire system was a perfect trap. Remain silent, and you were evasive. Speak too boldly, and you were manipulative. Show emotion, and you exposed your dark, evil nature. Stay calm and collected, and you revealed the cold heart of a witch. Every path, every choice, led directly to guilt. Perhaps the most grotesque corruption, though, was how the courts incentivized false confessions. In normal justice, a confession marks the end. You admit guilt, and you face punishment. But in Salem, confession was only the beginning of survival. Those who confessed weren't executed immediately. Instead, they were coaxed, even pressured, to supply more details, naming accomplices, describing secret meetings with the devil, weaving elaborate stories of sorcery. The more names they gave, the longer their own lives were spared. This system created a nightmarish inversion of morality. The innocent, who refused to confess to crimes they never committed, were hanged. The guilty, or more accurately, those willing to lie and incriminate others, were spared as long as they kept the accusations flowing. Tituba, the enslaved woman whose vivid confession helped ignite the panic, understood this dangerous game. She gave the court exactly what it wanted: colorful tales of witchcraft, satanic rituals, and a long list of alleged conspirators. Her survival was secured. Meanwhile, people like Rebecca Nurse, a 71-year-old grandmother respected for her piety and kindness, were executed because they clung to truth. John Proctor, a prosperous farmer who refused to sully his honor by confessing to dealings with the devil, was hanged for his integrity. The message was unmistakable truth. Did not matter. The court wasn't interested in innocence or guilt. They wanted obedience, compliance, and a steady stream of fuel to keep the machinery of hysteria running. The corruption was far too consistent to be dismissed as mere incompetence. This wasn't a group of simple-minded men bumbling into chaos. These magistrates were shrewd, educated, and fully aware of the principles they were discussing. They made a conscious choice to warp the law in order to serve their own interests. Take George Burroughs, the former minister accused of being the ringleader of Salem's witches. He had long-standing conflicts with members of the community, enemies who seized the opportunity to destroy him. When he was arrested in Maine and dragged back to face trial, the evidence was wafer thin, even by Salem's already perverse standards. Yet still, the court pressed forward because Burroughs wasn't on trial for witchcraft alone. He was on trial for daring to stand against the powerful. By the already twisted standards of Salem, the evidence against George Burroughs was astonishingly flimsy. Yet instead of demanding something more credible, the court responded by lowering the bar even further. Witnesses claimed he possessed unnatural strength because he could lift heavy objects with ease, a skill any healthy man might demonstrate. Even his ability to flawlessly recite the 23rd Psalm while standing on the gallows, a final act of dignity and faith, was warped into proof of witchcraft. For many in the crowd, his calm manner and perfect prayer stirred deep doubts about his guilt. But before compassion could take root, Cotton Mather, one of the most influential ministers driving the trials, quickly addressed the gathering. He reminded them that Satan himself could disguise his evil as an angel of light. In other words, Burroughs' innocence wasn't innocence at all, just another deception of the devil. This is the depth of dishonesty we're dealing with. The system was engineered so that every possible outcome confirmed guilt. Show kindness or piety. Clearly, the devil was masking your corruption. Show cruelty or impatience. Obvious proof of your evil nature. Present no evidence against you. That only demonstrated how cunning and dangerous you really were. Salem escorts had transformed into a grotesque machine that didn't seek truth, but rather converted accusations into executions as efficiently as possible. And perhaps the most horrifying realization is how many people participated in this charade. Judges twisted the law beyond recognition. Ministers cloaked corruption with sermons and scripture. Accusers, many of whom knew their claims were false, pressed forward with lies. A neighbor's ordinary townsfolk chose to remain silent, or worse, went along with the hysteria instead of resisting it. By the time the frenzy subsided, 20 innocent men and women had been executed. Hundreds more languished in filthy jails, some dying before they ever saw trial. Families were torn apart, reputations destroyed, property confiscated, and an entire community left haunted by its own complicity in what can only be described as murder cloaked in legality. But the darkest legacy of Salem cannot be measured solely in bodies, buried or homes seized. Its most chilling inheritance lies in the precedent it set. How swiftly a society can abandon justice when fear seizes the collective heart. How effortlessly the instruments of law can be weaponized into tools of persecution. And how disturbingly willing ordinary people are to become participants in atrocities when those acts are granted official approval and social validation. The Salem Witch Trials were not some strange accident or isolated event in history. They were the logical result of a culture that elevated fear over reason, obedience over conscience, and convenience over fairness. And the warning they leave behind is as urgent today as it was in 1692. Our cherished values and protections are fragile, and when fear rules, they can collapse almost overnight. Yet the corruption of Salem did not end there. If the trials exposed the perversion of justice, they also revealed something even more. In City East, the way accusations became weapons in long-standing feuds, the pointing of fingers was not simply random chaos. It was calculated, deliberate, and devastatingly effective. Take the case of Martha Corey, Her only crime was daring to express skepticism. When the early accusations began to spiral, she voiced the obvious, that the afflicted girls might be lying, or at least mistaken, and that spectral evidence had no place in a court of law. For that small act of reason, she was instantly branded a witch herself. The lesson was clear: dissent would not be tolerated. The accusers had discovered the perfect tool for silencing opposition. To question the proceedings was to invite imprisonment, or worse. It was a self-reinforcing cycle of fear that paralyzed the community. Speak out, and within days you could be in chains. And Salem was fertile ground for this weaponization. Beneath the surface, the village was already fractured, driven by disputes over church leadership, property boundaries, and generational inheritance. Neighbors had been battling one another for years, and now the witch trials gave them the perfect opportunity to settle old scores under the guise of righteousness. Rebecca Nurse's case illustrates this perfectly. She was a 71-year-old grandmother admired for her piety and charity, but her family had long feuded with the Putnams over land. When young Ann Putnam Jr. suddenly claimed that Rebecca's spirit was tormenting her, it was no divine revelation. It was a calculated strike in a decades-long land war. The trials became nothing less than a weapon of legal destruction, used to eliminate rivals under the mask of religious justice. The deeper you look, the more the pattern emerges. Accusations weren't scattered randomly. They clustered along old fault lines of power and property. Most of the accused came from the eastern side of Salem Village, while many of the accusers lived on the western side. This wasn't coincidence, it was strategy. For years, Salem Village had been divided along economic and political lines, and the witch trials became the ultimate battlefield for this rivalry. What had once been simmering disputes over land, influence, and leadership now escalated into open warfare, fought not with weapons, but with accusations of witchcraft. One faction sought to dominate the other, and the courtroom became their arena of annihilation. But the weaponization of witchcraft went far beyond land grabs and property disputes. The trials were also a brutal instrument of patriarchal control, targeting women who dared to live outside the rigid boundaries set for them. Widows who inherited property, women who ran taverns or small businesses, and those who spoke with too much independence were all easy prey. In a culture where women were expected to be silent, obedient, and deferential, even the smallest spark of autonomy could be twisted into evidence of demonic influence. Bridget Bishop's fate made this painfully clear. She owned a tavern, dressed in bold and colorful clothing, and had been married 3 times. To the Puritan establishment, she represented everything dangerous about a woman who refused to conform. By executing her first, the authorities sent a chilling warning to other women. Step out of line, and you could share the same fate. Economic jealousy also fueled the hysteria. Martha Carrier was accused in part because her family's success in farming stirred envy among neighbors. John Proctor became a target after criticizing the trials and threatening the profits of those who enriched themselves by seizing the property of the condemned. What began as a witch hunt morphed into a grotesque form of hostile takeover, where destroying rivals could be justified as holy duty. Even worse, the entire system created a perverse economy of accusation. Every official connected to the process, judges, jailers, sheriffs, even ministers had financial stakes in prolonging the trials. Each accusation meant more fees collected, more confiscated estates to divide, more influence to consolidate. The machinery of persecution had transformed into a marketplace, trading in human misery. The psychological manipulation was just as insidious. The afflicted girls quickly realized the power their performances granted them. In a society where young women had almost no voice, their fits and accusations commanded the full attention of the colony. They could disrupt trials, humble respected adults, and hold an entire community spellbound with their shrieks and convulsions. For a brief, intoxicating moment, they wielded more influence than the wealthiest men. But their newfound power trapped them as well. Each lie demanded another. Each act of possession required more dramatic flourishes to keep suspicion at bay. Some of the girls later expressed regret, but by then the damage was irreversible. 20 people were dead, and countless others had been shattered by their words. The trials revealed how quickly neighbor could turn against neighbor when fear clouded reason. Families that had shared meals and worked side by side for decades suddenly became enemies. Children were encouraged to testify against parents. Wives accused husbands, and husbands accused wives. The bonds that held the community together dissolved into paranoia, betrayal, and bloodshed. What is perhaps most unsettling is that it wasn't orchestrated solely by a handful of malicious figures. Ordinary people, farmers, housewives, craftsmen became active participants. They sat on juries that condemned the innocent. They gave false testimony that sealed their neighbors' fates. They gathered at hangings. As though they were community fairs, the trials thrived not just because of corrupt leaders, but because the wider community allowed, endorsed, and even celebrated them. And it all happened with terrifying speed. In barely a year, what began as the strange fits of a few young girls exploded into a reign of terror that consumed an entire region. More than 200 were accused, 20 executed, and others perished in squalid jails before trial. The frenzy escalated month by month, and through it all, the authorities cloaked their actions in the language of justice. They claimed to be defending the colony from evil, following due process, and protecting the innocent. In truth, they were presiding over a system built to crush anyone who threatened those in power. The Salem Witch Trials were not a bizarre anomaly or a quaint story of superstition gone wrong. They were a textbook demonstration of how fear can be cultivated, manipulated, and weaponized. Manufactured evidence, coerced confessions, social pressures to conform, and financial rewards for participation in these tactics weren't unique to Salem. They have reappeared throughout history whenever societies have decided that certain people are expendable. That's what makes Salem far worse than most people imagine. It wasn't about witches or demons at all. It was about human nature and how quickly civilization can collapse when fear outweighs justice, when accusation replaces evidence, and when law becomes an instrument of oppression rather than protection. The real terror of Salem was never supernatural. It was brutally, unmistakably human. Boring history. Why the Salem Witch Trials were worse than you thought, Part 4. The most haunting element of the Salem Witch Trials wasn't only the corruption of the courts or the greed that fueled the process. What makes the story truly terrifying is how ordinary people, neighbors, and friends turned on one another with a ferocity that would put the harshest medieval inquisitors to shame. Salem's community bonds had already been frail long before 1692, but the witch trials gave people the perfect excuse to air old grievances, destroy reputations, and permanently erase rivals from the village. Take the heartbreaking story of Rebecca Nurse, a 71-year-old grandmother beloved for her kindness, religious devotion, and gentle spirit. By all accounts, she was one of the most respected figures in Salem village. At first, even the magistrates hesitated to believe the charges when she was accused of witchcraft. But the accusers refused to back down, insisting that Nurse's specter had attacked them relentlessly. Why, then, was this elderly woman such a target? The answer lay not in sorcery, but in a festering land feud. For decades, her family had clashed bitterly with the powerful Putnam clan, and Putnam Sar, wife of Thomas Putnam, emerged as one of the loudest voices against her. Seen in that light, the accusations against Rebecca Nurse were less about the devil and far more about settling a family vendetta through deadly means. This climate of suspicion turned everyday life into a minefield. Long-standing friendships dissolved overnight. A stray comment, a burned loaf of bread, even a sideways glance, could suddenly be twisted into proof of witchcraft. The afflicted girls, who had once appeared to be helpless victims, quickly learned how much influence their words carried. With a mere accusation, they could topple someone's life. That intoxicating sense of control emboldened them to make bolder and bolder claims. Consider George Burroughs, a former minister of Salem who had left the village under stormy circumstances years earlier. When the trials escalated, the accusers declared not only that Burroughs was a witch, but that he was the chief architect of all witchcraft in New England, a sort of satanic commander, orchestrating the attacks on Salem. The so-called evidence against him was absurd. His physical strength seemed unusual. He could flawlessly recite scripture from memory, and he had remarried multiple times after losing wives to illness. In a reasonable court, none of this would have amounted to anything, but in Salem, such details were twisted into a narrative of dark power, and Burroughs was hanged. His true offense was not devil worship. but the enemies he made during his contentious ministry. Psychological terror soon became as destructive as the hangings themselves. The mere threat of being named was enough to keep people silent, compliant, and constantly on guard. Villagers adjusted their behavior, avoided certain people, and even censored their own words in hopes of avoiding suspicion. Families pressured their accused relatives to confess not because they believed them guilty, but because a false confession sometimes meant survival. This twisted the entire moral structure of the community. Lies became a pathway to life, while truth often guaranteed death. Martha Corey's ordeal captures this tragic reality. A respected church member, Corey openly questioned the legitimacy of the afflicted girl's visions. She suggested that the girls might be pretending or deluded, which was a rational stance given the hysteria. But in Salem, rationality was dangerous. Her doubts were instantly recast as evidence of guilt, as if she were protecting fellow witches. When she maintained her innocence and criticized the trials even during questioning, the court treated her defiance as proof that she was in league with the devil. In other words, to question the proceedings was itself a crime. Beneath it all ran a deep current of misogyny. While men certainly faced accusations and executions, women bore the brunt of the trials, and the reasons for their targeting often had less to do with religion than with defiance of gender expectations. Women who were outspoken, independent, or economically successful stood out as easy targets. Bridget Bishop, the very first victim executed, illustrates this perfectly. She kept a tavern, wore bright clothing, and had been married multiple times. She embodied qualities Puritan society scorned in women: confidence, independence, and financial stability. Her death sent a chilling signal to other women. Step outside the rigid role society demands, and you might pay with your life. Yet the trials weren't only about punishing individual women. They served a larger purpose, reinforcing the patriarchal order of Puritan New England. The young female accusers seemed powerful in the moment, but in reality, their voices mattered only when they reinforced the fears and grievances of the men in power. Their cries were not acts of liberation, but tools wielded to preserve a strict, male-dominated hierarchy. The Salem Witch Trials revealed not just paranoia and greed, but also the cold reality of how power structures dictated who lived and who died. When some of the afflicted girls dared to accuse members of influential families, such as the Mathers, their testimonies were abruptly dismissed as untrustworthy. The message was unmistakable. Women's voices carried weight only when they reinforced the interests of powerful men. The financial undercurrent of the trials grew darker still when we examine how property was handled. The moment someone was accused, their estate and assets were often frozen. Should they be executed, their possessions legally passed to the crown. This created a perverse incentive. The wealthier the accused, the more tempting the target. Sheriff Judge Corwin became infamous for his ruthless enthusiasm in seizing property, stripping households of livestock, furniture, and homes sometimes before the accused had even been tried. Families, left with nothing, were forced to flee Salem entirely to avoid both persecution and financial ruin. The case of Philip English stands as a stark example. English was one of Salem's most prosperous merchants, owning ships, warehouses, and valuable plots of land. When he and his wife were accused of witchcraft, they fled to New York for safety. In their absence, Corwin confiscated nearly everything they owned. The evidence against English was paper-thin, little more than gossip that his specter had been seen at supposed witch gatherings. His true offense was not sorcery, but being wealthy enough to spark envy and profitable enough to be destroyed. The devastation reached beyond those who stood trial. Families crumbled under the strain as relatives turned on one another, sometimes in genuine belief, other times out of sheer fear. Husbands testified against wives, children against parents, brothers against sisters. The once interwoven community, bound together by faith and mutual reliance, fragmented into isolated individuals, each terrified of being the next target. Meanwhile, the afflicted girls were tightening the noose of their own creation. Their dramatic fits became more elaborate, their descriptions of invisible torment more vivid. To maintain credibility, they were forced into a cycle of constant escalation. Each new claim had to outdo the last, or risk exposing them as frauds. What may have begun as hysteria Perhaps even the effects of contaminated rye, as some historians have suggested, soon transformed into something else entirely. A deliberate campaign of destruction, manipulated by adults, eager to use the chaos for personal advantage. The girl's initial suffering, real or imagined, became fuel for the ambitions of those in power. At the heart of this madness lay spectral evidency, most twisted form of testimony imaginable. It relied solely on the word of the accusers, who claimed to see the ghostly image of the accused attacking them invisibly. Such evidence could never be disproven. An accused person could present proof they were miles away, locked in jail, or bedridden. But none of it mattered. Their specter, the court reasoned, could appear anywhere at any time. In this warped system, accusation alone became equivalent to conviction. Even within the clergy, doubts about spectral evidence emerged. Cottonmather himself initially warned that the devil might impersonate innocent people to carry out evil deeds, making such testimony unreliable. Yet in the fevered climate of Salem, his caution was ignored until the accusations threatened the upper echelons of colonial society. When the afflicted girls began pointing fingers at individuals like Lady Phipps, the governor's wife, suddenly the standards for evidence tightened overnight. This exposed the raw class divisions embedded in the trials. Poor women like Sarah Good were swiftly condemned and executed, while wealthier, well-connected individuals found ways to stall proceedings, delay trials, or escape entirely until the hysteria subsided. The double standard was undeniable. In Salem, justice was not blind, it was for sale, and its price was influence and status. Perhaps most damning of all was the utter collapse of legal protections, supposedly guaranteed by English common law. The accused were denied legal counsel. They were prevented from meaningfully confronting their accusers. Impartial juries became impossible when fear ruled every corner of the courtroom. What passed as justice in Salem was, in truth, the complete abandonment of it. Instead of fair hearings, the accused were confronted by hostile magistrates who appeared more interested in extracting confessions than in uncovering the truth. The very foundation of justice, innocent until proven guilty, was flipped completely on its head. In Salem, people were presumed guilty, and proving innocence was often an impossible task. The tactics used to force confessions would not have been out of place in some of the darkest totalitarian regimes of the modern era. Prisoners were deprived of sleep, subjected to intense psychological pressure, threatened with harm to their loved ones, and promised mercy if only they would admit to crimes they had never committed. Some were forced to undergo humiliating prayer tests in which they had to flawlessly recite scripture. The smallest mistake was seized. Upon his proof that the devil was at work. Others endured physical ordeals such as the infamous touch test, where an afflicted accuser would supposedly be cured of their fits if touched by the person accused of witchcraft. The pace of the trials only magnified the injustice. From the first accusations in February 1692 until the last executions at September, the entire calamity unfolded in less than 8 months. In that short window, hundreds of people were named, dozens were thrown into disease-ridden jails, and 20 were executed. The whirlwind speed of the proceedings left no time for calm reflection or reasoned judgment. It kept the atmosphere of fear at a fever pitch and prevented organized resistance from ever taking shape. Looking back, it is tempting to dismiss all of this as the inevitable product of a more superstitious and primitive time. But that interpretation is dangerously shallow. The Salem Witch Trials were not simply a breakdown of logic, they were the deliberate construction of a system designed to crush dissent and secure power. Superstition provided the mask, but beneath it lay clear political and economic motives. The greatest horror of Salem was not that people believed in witches. It was that belief being cynically exploited as a weapon against rivals, neighbors, and enemies. The consequences echo far beyond colonial message. Salem stands as a grim reminder of how easily fear and ambition can strip away the safeguards of justice. Institutions built to protect the innocent can just as easily be twisted into engines of oppression. The men and women who died there were not victims of mere ignorance. They were casualties of a calculated campaign of terror in which greed, revenge, and the hunger for authority outweighed truth. These were not tragic accidents. They were state-sanctioned murders carried out by people who understood exactly what they were doing. That is what makes Salem so haunting. The threat it reveals has nothing to do with magic or demons. It shows that evil doesn't require the supernatural, it only requires people willing to exploit fear, prejudice, and suspicion for their own gain. The mechanisms that fueled Salem fear of outsiders, the abandonment of due process, the manipulation of accusations, and the corruption of trusted institutions are not relics of the 17th century. They are timeless tools that ruthless individuals have used again and again in every era and every society. The names may change, the justifications may evolve, but the underlying dynamic remains chillingly recognizable. Salem was not some bizarre anomaly in human history. It was a prototype. Whenever a community chooses fear over reason, convenience over conscience, and authority over truth, the path that Salem followed is never far away. The witch trials of 1692 to 1693 provide a devastating illustration of how fear and systemic corruption can transform an ordinary town into an instrument of terror. What began as strange fits in a handful of girls erupted into a judicial nightmare where the weakest members of society became easy prey in a deadly cycle of accusation and punishment. Yet the darkest legacy of Salem lies not only in the 20 souls who were hanged, but in the complete collapse of justice itself. By admitting spectral evidence, by stripping the accused of the right to legal defense, by making confession the only possible route to survival, Salem mutated from a supposed bastion of moral purity into a stage 4 institutionalized persecution. The trials revealed how fragile civilization can be when fear is allowed to dominate reason. Neighbors who once shared meals and prayers became enemies overnight. Children became weapons, their words carrying the power to decide between life and death. The very pillars of community, the courts and the church, were transformed into instruments of destruction. Perhaps most unsettling is how methodical the targeting really was. The accusations did not fall randomly. The earliest victims were those already marginalized. Sarah Good, a destitute beggar. Sarah Osborne, a woman shamed for her unconventional relationship. And Tituba, an enslaved woman with no protections under the law. These first women, Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba from Barbados, lived on the outer edges of Puritan life, which made them convenient scapegoats for a frightened community, desperate to find meaning in the chaos. But once the frenzy took hold, it refused to stop there. The circle of suspicion widened, pulling in anyone who dared challenge the trials or who happened to stand on the wrong side of simmering feuds and old grudges, petty rivalries over property, lingering business disputes, and personal jealousies were suddenly reframed as matters of life and death through charges of witchcraft. In Salem, accusation became a weapon that anyone could wield if they knew how to exploit the machinery of fear. Even more unsettling were the financial motivations that underpinned much of the persecution. The moment the accused were declared guilty, their land and belongings could be seized. Court officials were paid for each case they processed, while informants could profit by pointing fingers at their neighbors. In this way, the trials became less about hunting witches and more about hunting wealth, power, and opportunity. What appeared to be a crusade against the devil was, in reality, a marketplace where justice was bought, sold, and traded. Perhaps the greatest tragedy lies in how ordinary people who might otherwise have considered themselves moral, upright, and devout were swept into complicity. Many accusers, magistrates, and spectators did not see themselves as cruel or corrupt. They genuinely believed they were saving their town from an invisible, supernatural menace. But their absolute certainty, combined with their willingness to abandon fairness, due process, and logic, turned them into willing agents of a system that crushed the innocent. The psychological tools used during the trials only reinforced this machinery of persecution. Forced confessions wrung out under the shadow of the gallows, testimonies from children, treated as irrefutable truth. No acceptance of spectral evidence that no one could ever disprove. These methods blurred the line between fact and imagination until truth itself became irrelevant. In such a world, innocence offered no shield. The only path to survival was confession, a willingness to play along with the delusion, to join the very system that was devouring one's community. The collapse of the hysteria was almost as revealing as its rise. Once prominent and respected citizens began to face accusations, and even the governor's own wife came under suspicion. The tide quickly turned. Suddenly, the very forms of evidence that had justified executions were declared unreliable. The same officials who had demanded blood now scrambled to wash their hands of responsibility. But by then, the damage was done. Families were shattered, reputations ruined, communities torn apart. An entire generation carried the scars of Salem, haunted by how quickly their orderly world had descended into madness. The Salem Witch Trials remain a permanent warning about the perils of letting fear masquerade as righteousness. They demonstrate how swiftly justice can be twisted when passion overtakes evidence, when the weak are sacrificed to preserve the comfort of the powerful, and when hysteria is mistaken for moral clarity. We may flatter ourselves today by believing that we are immune, that modern legal systems, scientific knowledge, and centuries of reflection protect us from such disasters. Yet the impulses that drove Salem, fear of outsiders, craving for simple answers to complex problems, the readiness to believe rumors over facts, and the lure of moral panic still live within us. The lesson of Salem is that civilization survives only through constant vigilance, not just against enemies beyond our borders, but against our own capacity for cruelty when convinced it serves a greater good. The trials teach us that the danger lies not in witches or the supernatural, but in how effortlessly ordinary men, women, and children can become instruments of injustice when they surrender conscience to the mob. The 20 victims did not die because they practiced sorcery. They perished because their society abandoned compassion in favor of fear, reason in favor of superstition, and justice in favor of vengeance. Their deaths remain a testament to the catastrophic cost of forsaking the principles that keep civilization from collapsing into barbarism. Their memory whispers a warning across the centuries that this darkness is never far away, and it can resurface anywhere, at any time, whenever human beings convince themselves that cruelty is justified. And perhaps most chilling of all is how the trials revealed the terrifying ease with which human psychology can be manipulated on a mass scale. The accusers did not simply invent stories at random. They tapped into the deepest anxieties of their neighbors, turning fear into a weapon and suspicion into power. Through a systematic campaign of terror, they pitted community against community, a form of psychological manipulation so effective that even modern propagandists would marvel at its success. At the center of this campaign were the afflicted girls, led most famously by Abigail Williams and Mercy Lewis, who stumbled upon a devastating formula for influence. The girls had stumbled upon something far more potent than any charm or spell. They discovered that within a society built on rigid hierarchies, unspoken tensions, and deep insecurities, the right accusation, launched at the right time, could topple households, ruin reputations, and reorder the entire balance of power. What unfolded wasn't simply teenage hysteria, it was a series of carefully calculated performances, crafted to exploit every weakness in the Puritan worldview. Their choice of targets was anything but random. They began with Tituba, the enslaved woman from Barbados, whose foreign origins, unfamiliar customs, and outsider status made her an easy victim. Then came Sarah Good, a destitute beggar, already despised for her poverty and isolation. Soon after, Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman who had transgressed social norms by living with a man outside of wedlock, was drawn into the storm. Each of these women represented the margins of society, and each accusation struck at those least able to defend themselves. But the girls' true mastery lay in how they escalated their campaign. Once the community had accepted that outcasts could indeed be witches, they boldly shifted their sights toward more respected figures. They understood a critical truth. Credibility builds in layers. Each condemnation lent weight to the next, and every execution paved the way for the next death to be justified. By the time respected citizens were accused, the community had already been conditioned to believe. Central to their strategy was their skillful use of spectral evidence, that perverse innovation that allowed dreams, visions, and unseen apparitions to be presented as valid courtroom testimony. The girls would writhe in the courtroom, screaming that ghostly shapes of the accused clawed at them, choking them, stabbing them with invisible knives. And when skeptics demanded proof, the girls had the perfect shield. How could anyone disprove what they claimed to see in the spirit world? In that warped logic, denial became further evidence of guilt. The system itself was constructed so that resistance confirmed the very charges it sought to refute. This wasn't merely a legal loophole, it was psychological warfare. In a culture terrified of the unseen and obsessed with the supernatural, the power to interpret the invisible became the ultimate form of control. The accused could not defend themselves against crimes that existed only in dreams, and the louder they protested their innocence, the more guilty they appeared. Even the community's leaders, men who prided themselves on education and spiritual discernment, fell victim to this manipulation. Parris, the local minister, and Corwin, one of Massachusetts' most prominent theologians, transformed what could have been dismissed as adolescent theater into a divine battle against Satan himself. The girls' antics became sacred testimony, and skepticism was equated with heresy. The trials also revealed a profound flaw in human reasoning: confirmation bias. Every unusual event became proof of witchcraft. If Martha Corey was accused and her husband later fell ill, it was not attributed to natural causes or stress, but to her supernatural influence. A sudden storm during a hearing wasn't whether it was demonic interference shielding the guilty. Good harvests were interpreted as God's blessing on their crusade, while bad harvests confirmed that witches still roamed free, demanding harsher prosecutions. No matter the outcome, the system justified itself. Perhaps most disturbing was how these trials exploited humanity's deep need for meaning in the midst of chaos. The Puritans lived under constant strain threats of native raids, outbreaks of disease, economic hardship, and the daily uncertainty of survival. The witch trials offered something intoxicating: an explanation. Instead of accepting that misfortune could be random, they found comfort in assigning blame. Witches could be identified, tried, and executed. It gave them the illusion of control in a world that otherwise felt unpredictable and cruel. The afflicted girls had tapped into something primal: the need to believe that someone, even a malevolent force, was directing events. It was easier to believe that misfortunes came from witches' spells than to accept the terrifying truth that life was often random, unfair, and utterly beyond their control. As the panic deepened, social bonds disintegrated. Neighbors who had trusted one another for decades suddenly eyed each other with suspicion. Friends became informants. Parents were pressured to testify against children, and siblings against siblings. Trust itself became dangerous, while isolation became the only form of safety. In a culture where shame and reputation meant survival, the mere whisper of witchcraft was enough to ruin a life. Even if execution was avoided, the accused often lost their homes, their businesses, and their place in society. The accusation alone was a sentence of social death. This atmosphere of fear and manipulation reached even into the confessions. Those accused were forced into an impossible dilemma, one that I'll explore in the next section. To confess or not to confess, that was the impossible dilemma faced by the accused. To hold fast to innocence almost guaranteed the gallows, but to admit to crimes they had never committed meant saving their bodies while damning their souls. Many chose confession, not because they believed the accusations, but because they understood the rigged nature of the game. These false admissions then became evidence used to condemn others, setting off a chain reaction of guilt manufactured out of thin air. What passed for justice in Salem wasn't legal procedure. It was psychological warfare carefully designed to crush resistance and create a climate of obedience. In this twisted system, survival itself demanded complicity. To escape becoming a victim, one had to help create new ones. And the most unsettling part was how this process transformed ordinary people into accomplices. Neighbors who once exchanged greetings over fence lines now nodded solemnly in court as absurd accusations were read aloud. Parents who should have defended their children instead handed them over to the hangman. Respected ministers and civic leaders who should have demanded evidence and fairness instead treated the wildest claims as unshakable truth. What the afflicted girls and their adult supporters achieved was something that military conquerors and revolutionaries often failed to accomplish. They reshaped an entire community. As understanding of reality, they made the absurd seem logical. They made cruelty appear righteous. They convinced people that the unthinkable was not only possible, but necessary. Through sheer performance and manipulation, they had weaponized humanity's own capacity for self-deception, turning it against the very people who had trusted them. As the months dragged on and the graveyards filled, cracks began to appear in the facade. Some whispered doubts. Others began to wonder whether they had unleashed a monster they could no longer control. Yet by then, it was too late. Too many lives, reputations, and institutions were already entangled in the machinery of destruction. Judges who had sent innocent men and women to their deaths couldn't suddenly admit they had erred without destroying their own authority. Ministers who thundered from the pulpit about Satan's grip on Salem couldn't to reverse course without shattering their spiritual influence, and the accusers themselves, who had condemned neighbors with their testimonies, couldn't confess to deception without risking vengeance from the families they had devastated. The trials had developed a momentum all their own, a fire that consumed everything in its path. It was a psychological inferno fueled not by demons, but by human weakness. Fear, pride, envy, and the stubborn refusal to admit error. The girls had struck the match, but the blaze was kept alive by a community unwilling to face the truth. It would burn on until it exhausted itself, leaving behind ashes of broken families and a legacy of shame. And herein lies Salem's darkest revelation. No supernatural forces were needed to explain the catastrophe. The evil that stalked the village came not from witches' covenants, but from the very human ability to exploit fear, manipulate psychology, and rationalize cruelty. The true terror of Salem wasn't the devil in disguise, it was the neighbors, ministers, and judges who let belief override compassion, and who used that belief to justify unimaginable acts against one another. By the time the trials entered their bloodiest phase, the system had become a grotesque parody of justice. Imagine being dragged before the court, accused of signing the devil's book or sending your specter to torment the innocent. The evidence against you might be nothing more than a girl's dream, a neighbor's cow failing to give milk, or the memory of you casting a strange glance before someone developed a headache. In any rational courtroom, such claims would spark laughter. But Salem had abandoned reason. The judges not only accepted this so-called spectral evidence, they considered it the most damning testimony of all. Bridget Bishop, the first to die on the gallows, was condemned largely because people swore her ghostly figure had haunted them in visions. There were no witnesses to any real crime, no tangible proof, no physical evidence. Yet that was enough to end her life and to set the deadly precedent that would claim 19 more. The examination process itself was engineered to crush the accused. Picture it: a stifling meeting house packed with glaring neighbors, a panel of grim magistrates staring you down, and the accusers collapsing into fits the moment you enter, shrieking that your invisible hand is choking them. Above it all, presiding with ruthless certainty, was Judge William Stoughton, Chief Justice, who would become the most relentless figure of the entire ordeal. Judge William Stoughton and his fellow magistrates perfected some of the most insidious techniques ever devised for extracting confessions. He would press the accused with impossible questions, demanding to know why the girls writhed in agony if the prisoner before him wasn't afflicting them. When the accused, bewildered, frightened, and unable to provide a rational answer, hesitated or faltered, Stoughton would point to that silence as undeniable proof of guilt. Among the cruelest tools was the so-called touch test. The belief went that if a witch laid hands on her victim, the supernatural torment would stop at once. So the accused were forced to place their hands upon the screaming girls. An uncouth moment of contact brought the performances to an abrupt halt. To the judges and the eager crowd, this appeared to be irrefutable evidence of witchcraft. Yet it was nothing more than theater, a performance the accusers controlled entirely, stopping or starting their convulsions to secure the desired outcome. Perhaps the most twisted element of all was how confession became both deliverance and damnation. Those who admitted to witchcraft were often spared the noose, at least for a time, but their survival came at a devastating cost. Every confession demanded accomplices. The accused were pressured to name neighbors, relatives, or townsfolk as fellow conspirators. Each coerced admission birthed new suspects, expanding the web of accusations until no family felt safe. Consider the plight of Tituba, the enslaved woman whose confession helped ignite the firestorm. Threatened with certain execution if she held her innocence, she instead spun a vivid tale of pacts with the devil, of flying through the night sky and attending dark assemblies. Her words, born of desperation, gave the magistrates exactly what they craved: validation of their belief in a vast demonic conspiracy lurking within Salem. The psychological pressure behind such confessions was staggering. Prisoners languished for months in overcrowded, squalid jails, half-starved and stripped of comfort, enduring repeated interrogations designed to wear down their will. Time and again, they were told that only confession offered a chance at survival. Families, terrified of losing loved ones, begged them to admit guilt simply to stay alive. The result was heartbreaking. Men and women who had stood firm in their innocence finally broke under the crushing weight of fear and despair. Mary Warren offers one of the most tragic examples. Initially one of the accusers herself, she later tried to retract her claims, confessing that much of what had been said was false. But in attempting to speak truth, she became a target. The court turned against her, interrogating her until, under unbearable pressure, she resumed her role as an accuser. Her story shows how thoroughly the system corrupted even those who tried to resist it. The trials also revealed how swiftly ordinary friendships and neighborly trust could dissolve once fear and suspicion took root. People who had shared meals and worshipped together for decades now eyed each other with dread. Old rivalries over property lines or inheritances suddenly re-emerged as accusations of witchcraft. Resentments, long buried, were reborn in the language of diabolical vengeance. The case of Rebecca Nurse demonstrates this most clearly. A 71-year-old grandmother, revered throughout Salem for her compassion and steadfast faith. She had spent her life caring for the sick and comforting families in their darkest hours. When she was accused of witchcraft, the community was stunned. Many neighbors even signed a petition testifying to her good character. But even a lifetime of virtue could not withstand the juggernaut of suspicion once it began rolling. The afflicted girls claimed her specter tormented them. Patients she had once healed were pressured into twisting her kindness into evidence of dark arts. Her devotion to prayer was reframed as a cunning disguise, her herbal remedies rebranded as proof of unnatural powers. Her age and hearing loss worked against her as well. When she struggled to follow the rapid questioning, her confusion was presented as more evidence of guilt. Manuel. The accusers put on their usual performance, collapsing into fits and crying out that her invisible hand was upon them. At first, against all odds, the jury returned a verdict of not guilty. But Judge Stoughton refused to accept such an outcome. He sent the jury back to reconsider, and under the crushing pressure of the court, they reversed themselves. Rebecca Nurse was sentenced to die. Offered one final chance to save herself by confessing, she stood firm, refusing to admit to sins she had never committed. On July 19, 1692, she went to the gallows, proclaiming her innocence until her last breath. Her case reveals the darkest truth of Salem. Innocence itself became a form of guilt. Those who lied and confessed were spared. Those who clung to the truth were condemned. Justice no longer concerned itself with fact or fairness. It existed only to reinforce the court's own narrative. No matter how twisted, the hysteria spread so far and wide that even children were not spared its merciless grasp. Some as young as 4 years old found themselves accused, imprisoned, and subjected to trauma their young minds could never comprehend. Dorothy Good, the small daughter of Sarah Good, was only for when she was dragged into a jail cell, forced to endure months of confinement and fear. For a child, barely old enough to understand the meaning of such accusations, the psychological scars must have been immeasurable. Yet the courts, blinded by fanaticism, showed no compassion. H offered no shield against the monster Salem had created. BT's point, the trials had become a self-sustaining engine of destruction. Each execution reinforced the judge's conviction that they were soldiers in a righteous war against unseen forces. Every coerced confession fed their obsession, confirming in their eyes that the devil's web was indeed spread across the colony. The system no longer needed external proof. It manufactured its own evidence, validated itself with each hanging, and justified its existence by the devastation it caused. As the sweltering summer of 1692 gave way to autumn, Salem had transformed into a community consumed by dread. Trusts evaporated. Neighbors who once greeted one another warmly now at each other with suspicion. A single whisper could mark you for death. It was no longer about truth or justice, but about survival. What emerged from this chaos was a chilling lesson about human nature. How swiftly reason can be abandoned when fear dominates. How easily justice can be corrupted when authority bows to hysteria, and how fragile civilization becomes when humanity is sacrificed to paranoia. Welcome back, fellow seekers of history. Before we push further into this grim tale, I'd love to know where you're re-listening from and what inspired you to dive into this chapter of our past. Whether you're winding down for the evening or taking a short break during your day, I'm truly grateful you've chosen to walk through these sobering events with me. If you find these explorations meaningful, I invite you to subscribe and join a community of curious minds dedicated to uncovering the truths no matter dark hidden in our collective history. Now, let us continue peeling back the layers of the Salem Witch Trials. Beyond the madness of spectral evidence, coerced confessions, and collective hysteria, there lies another unsettling truth. These accusations were not always born of genuine fear of witchcraft. Many were calculated strikes, sharpened weapons wielded in long-standing personal and political battles. The trials were not simply the result of religious extremism or communal panic. They were also the culmination of decades of festering disputes, simmering resentments, and unhealed wounds within colonial mess. And what makes this even more chilling is how certain individuals recognized in the witchcraft panic a golden opportunity to settle scores, seize land, or eliminate rivals under the convenient guise of battling Satan. Take, for example, the case of Rebecca Nurse. This 71-year-old grandmother was revered by many as a model of kindness and Christian virtue. Yet her family had long been embroiled in a bitter feud with the powerful Putnam clan, a land dispute that stretched back to the 1640s. When Rebecca's husband, Francis, had purchased a large tract of land, the Putnams believed it had been taken from them unjustly. For decades, lawsuits, quarrels, and accusations of fraud poisoned relations between the families. When the witch trials began, it was no surprise that an M. Putnam Sr. leveled one of the first accusations against Rebecca Nurse, claiming her specter tormented her and her daughter. The timing was telling. Just months earlier, the Nurse family had scored another legal victory in the ongoing land dispute. What followed was nothing less than a calculated campaign. The accusations spread beyond Rebecca to other members of the Nurse family, a strategy that threatened to uproot the entire lineage and remove the Putnams' rivals once and for all. The tragedy lies in the bitter irony that Rebecca Nurse was known across the village for her piety and generosity. She had nursed the sick, aided women in childbirth, and offered comfort to families in grief. Even some of Salem's most respected citizens testified to her upright character. Yet in a system that no longer valued reason or tangible evidence, such character witnesses became useless. In fact, they could even backfire. When 39 respected townsfolk signed a petition defending Rebecca, their loyalty only raised suspicion. Soon, some of these very signers found themselves under scrutiny, accused of witchcraft by association. This weaponization of accusations was not confined to the Nurse-Putnam feud. Across Salem and nearby villages, witchcraft became the perfect pretext to settle disputes unrelated to the supernatural. Land boundaries, trade rivalries, marital conflicts, even personal grudges, everything could be reframed as evidence of diabolic plots. The case of Martha Corey shows just how dangerous skepticism itself had become. Corey had made the mistake of questioning the validity of the early accusations against Tituba and others. But in an environment poisoned by hysteria, Tao itself was branded as guilt. After all, how could anyone doubt the reality of witchcraft unless they, too, were secretly allied with the devil? Martha Corey's husband, Giles Corey, found himself caught in one of the most tragic arcs of the Salem Witch Trials. At first, Giles lent his voice to the accusations against his wife, perhaps thinking that distancing himself would protect him from suspicion. But as the madness escalated and the cruelty of the trials became undeniable, he experienced a change of heart. He began to question the proceedings openly, condemning the injustice he saw unfolding. That act of courage would seal his fate. Soon, Giles himself was accused of witchcraft. Unlike others, he refused to play the court's twisted game. He would not plead guilty, nor would he declare himself innocent. Under English common law, this refusal to enter a plea meant that a trial could not proceed, but it also allowed the authorities to unleash a horrific punishment. Peine forte et dura. Slow, agonizing death by pressing under heavy stones until the victim either entered a plea or perished. For 2 grueling days, the 80-year-old man endured the unimaginable. More and more weight was piled upon his chest, his ribs cracking under the strain, his breath growing shallow. Witnesses recalled that his only words during this torture were a defiant demand. More weight. He would give his tormentors no satisfaction. Giles Corey died unbroken, the only person in American history to be pressed to death. And yet, even in this horrific end, there was calculation. Had Corey entered a plea and been convicted, his land would have been seized by the crown. By refusing, he ensured that his estate would pass to his children rather than enrich the very system that had destroyed his wife. In death, he both resisted injustice and protected his family's legacy. The targeting of the Corys illustrates how accusations spread like wildfire, consuming not only individuals, but entire families. Once someone was accused, suspicion naturally extended to spouses, children, friends, and neighbors. Each accusation birthed more suspects. Each execution created new grief and with it, new resentment that could easily be twisted into further charges. Bonds that once defined the strength of a community, friendship, kinship, loyalty were recast as evidence of guilt. Defending an accused person was seen as proof of complicity. Acts of kindness became suspicious. Even family devotion could be reinterpreted as evidence of secret covens. The fate of Sarah Good highlights just how ruthlessly vulnerable people were targeted. A destitute beggar who wandered Salem in search of food or shelter. Sarah's poverty made her his downfall highlights another dark truth. The trials could be used as weapons of economic warfare. Salem was a rapidly expanding port, with merchants competing fiercely for markets and trade routes. The witchcraft accusations offered unscrupulous rivals a shortcut to eliminate competition. Instead of vying for dominance in the marketplace, they could destroy an opponent's reputation, confiscate their property, and drive them from town under the guise of religious purity. The genius of the scheme lay in its impossibility to disprove. How could one demonstrate that business success came from hard work rather than a pact with the devil? In Salem, innocence itself became indefensible. Equally chilling was the psychological theater that fueled the trials. The group of young women whose visions and convulsions ignited the hysteria wielded their performance like a weapon. Their fits followed predictable patterns designed for maximum dramatic effect. First, small complaints of being pinched or pricked, escalating into violent seizures, blindness, or apparent attempts at self-harm. These scenes almost always erupted at moments of high tension in the courtroom, particularly when the accused tried to defend themselves. To outside observers, the displays seemed spontaneous, raw, and frighteningly real. Yet a closer reading of the historical record reveals careful coordination. The girls often mirrored one another's symptoms, adjusted their stories in unison, and invented new accusations that dovetailed neatly with the prosecution's needs. What appeared to be uncontrolled hysteria was, at least in part, deliberate calculation. The tragic case of Mary Warren demonstrates how even the accusers could be consumed by the machinery they helped create. Initially one of the most vocal participants, Warren eventually recanted her claims and admitted that much of what the girls had said was false. For a fleeting moment, she attempted to reveal the truth that the fits and visions were fabrications, but her honesty came at a terrible cost. The same girls who had once stood beside her quickly turned against her, accusing her of witchcraft. Under the crushing weight of fear and facing the very real possibility of execution, Mary Warren retracted her confession of deceit and returned to her role as an accuser. Her brief rebellion, nevertheless, cracked the facade. It revealed that the alleged supernatural afflictions could appear and disappear on command, surfacing when politically useful and vanishing when they were not. That revelation, though quickly buried beneath renewed accusations, exposed the trials for what they were. Not a divine battle against evil, but a manufactured performance designed to manipulate, control, and destroy. The entire machinery of the Salem Witch Trials rested on a fraudulent and carefully constructed foundation. The psychological warfare inflicted on the accused was as deliberate as it was devastating. The methods of interrogation employed by the magistrates were never intended to uncover truth. They were calculated to dismantle resistance and coerce confessions, whether genuine or fabricated. Those accused of witchcraft were forced to endure endless hours of interrogation, often restrained, weakened by hunger, and deprived of rest. Every question posed to them was a trap with no escape. A denial was labeled stubbornness and proof of deceit. A confession was never enough. On its own, it had to be accompanied by the naming of accomplices, which in turn expanded the circle of suspicion. And silence, even when chosen in desperation, was twisted into evidence of guilt. The process was engineered to ensure one outcome: conviction. The ordeal of Tituba, the enslaved woman whose early confession helped ignite the entire hysteria, illustrates just how powerful this psychological manipulation could be. Presured, relentlessly, very likely through both mental torment and physical abuse, eventually gave a vivid and detailed account of supposed pacts with the devil. She described shadowy meetings, acts of dark worship, and even named others in the community as witches. Tituba's testimony, though coerced, became the model for every confession that followed. Her words created a template, a script that all later accused were expected to follow. Those who resisted this pattern, who denied the charges or strayed from the accepted narrative, were branded as defiant threats and considered beyond redemption. Adding to the tragedy was the central role children played in fueling the hysteria. Young girls such as 11-year-old Abigail Williams and 9-year-old Ann Putnam Jr. were elevated from bystanders to star witnesses. Far from being innocent participants, these children were shaped and guided by the adults around them, adults who quickly realized that the claims of the young would appear far more credible than those of grown men and women. By placing children in the spotlight, the court created a system where doubting their words meant doubting the testimony of supposed innocence itself. But these children were never acting alone. Their accusations consistently reflected the rivalries, grudges, and ambitions of the adults in their families. In Putnam Jr.'s case, her supernatural visions seemed to align almost perfectly with her family's social and economic interests, strongly suggesting manipulation and coaching. The long shadow of trauma followed these young accusers well into adulthood. Historical records hint at the guilt and emotional damage many carried for the rest of their lives. Only N. Putnam Jr. would eventually make a public confession of remorse. In 1706, she admitted that she had been deluded by Satan and begged forgiveness from the families of those she had helped condemn. Yet by then, the harm was irreversible. 20 lives had already been taken, countless families shattered, and the town of Salem scarred beyond recognition. The Salem Witch Trials, then, cannot be dismissed as a simple product of superstition or a quaint relic of the past. They serve as a chilling reminder of how quickly reason can collapse and justice can become a weapon of tyranny. They reveal the precise mechanics of how a rational society can spiral into madness, fear overwhelming logic, institutions betraying their protective duties, personal vendettas disguising themselves as holy crusades, and the defenseless becoming scapegoats for collective anxieties. The tactics used in Salem fabricated evidence, the shifting of the burden of proof onto the accused, the deliberate cultivation of fear, the exploitation of prejudice, and even the cynical use of children as instruments of not unique to the 17th century. These same dynamics reappear throughout history, again and again, whenever fear is manipulated by those who understand its power. What makes Salem's tragedy particularly unsettling is not just the injustice itself, but the speed at which it unfolded. In only a few short months, a functioning legal system was transformed into an engine of execution. Protections that seemed secure collapsed almost overnight, showing just how fragile the safeguards of justice truly are. And perhaps the most sobering truth of all is that this catastrophe was not born out of ignorance or lack of education. It was the result of conscious choices made by leaders, judges, and ministers who knew better, who recognized the unreliability of spectral evidence, yet embraced it because it served their ends. The ministers who endorsed the trials were not ignorant of Scripture. They fully understood they were violating the very principles of justice their faith claimed to uphold, and the accusers, rather than exposing true threats, were often settling grudges, silencing rivals, or redirecting blame for their own hardships. The Salem Witch Trials were far more horrifying than many people realized, not simply because of the scale of death or the cruelty of the punishments, though both were significant, but because they revealed how ordinary men and women in seemingly ordinary communities could become agents of extraordinary evil once fear and suspicion were allowed to rule. The story of Salem reminds us that justice is not it must be guarded constantly. Protecting the innocent requires courage, the kind of courage that dares to speak truth in the face of authority, even when that truth is inconvenient, unpopular, or dangerous. And while centuries have passed since the gallows stood in Salem, the warnings remain urgent. In today's world, where division, fear, and misinformation still threaten to undermine reason and justice, the lessons of Salem are painfully relevant. The methods of scapegoating and manipulation may have evolved, but their core remains the same. The only true defense lies in a steadfast devotion to evidence, fairness, and the protection of society's most vulnerable principles that the people of Salem tragically abandoned, staining their history with enduring shame. The Terror of Salem is not only a story about the past, it is a mirror showing the human capacity for cruelty and self-deception whenever fear triumphs over justice. It is a reminder of how fragile civilization is, and how easily it can unravel if vigilance falters and fear is weaponized. This brings us to part 10 of our 12-part exploration. Why the Salem Witch Trials were worse than you thought. What made these trials truly terrifying was not only the countless injustices, or the collapse of legal safeguards, it was the way the entire town became entangled in what can best be described as a carefully orchestrated form of psychological warfare. In Salem, fear turned parents against children, husbands against wives, and neighbor against neighbor, leaving scars that would ripple for generations. The groundwork for this hysteria had been laid long before the first accusation. For decades, Puritan ministers had instilled their congregations with a deep paranoia about Satan's constant presence. Influential figures like Cotton Mather preached tirelessly that the devil lurked behind every unexplained illness, every accident, every failed crop. This was not incidental, it was a deliberate tactic to maintain order through fear, conditioning the community to see calamity as evidence of demonic activity. So when the accusations began, the stage was already perfectly set. And the accusations themselves were anything but random. The afflicted girls who screamed, convulsed, and pointed trembling fingers were not acting in a vacuum. They were encouraged, guided, and even rewarded for their performances. Each accusation gave them attention, sympathy, and a kind of authority they had never known in a rigidly patriarchal society. For perhaps the first time, these young women, who normally had no agency, were wielding power over adults, even deciding life or death. The personal histories of many accusers also revealed disturbing patterns. Several came from homes fractured by trauma or tragedy. Mercy Lewis had witnessed her parents killed in a brutal Indian raid. Abigail Williams was an orphan, dependent on her uncle for survival. These were not cunning masterminds. They were vulnerable children who had been manipulated, weaponized by adults with their own motives. But the most chilling aspect was not the children. Esrolit was the eagerness with which the wider community embraced the destruction of their neighbors. The trials were not simply the work of a handful of malicious leaders pulling the strings. They succeeded because the broader population allowed them to succeed. People carried grievances, jealousies, and resentments that had festered for years. The trials became a convenient stage to air these old wounds, while cloaking revenge in the language of righteousness. Take Martha Corey, for example, known for her devoutness and generosity. She nevertheless made the fatal mistake of doubting the legitimacy of the accusations. Her husband, Giles Corey, under pressure, offered testimony that contributed to her downfall. Later, when Giles himself was accused and realized the monstrous injustice of the system, it was too late to undo the damage. The trials had already torn their family apart. Economic motivations added yet another sinister layer. An accusation did not just destroy reputations, it stripped entire families of their property. Homes, farms, and possessions could be seized, creating a grim incentive for false accusations. Thomas Putnam, one of the most aggressive figures in the trials and whose daughter was among the chief accusers, had ongoing land disputes with many of those later condemned. Coincidence? Hardly. Beyond money, the trials also functioned as tools of social engineering. The overwhelming majority of the accused were women, and not just any women, but those who defied the strict mold of Puritan expectations. Widows who inherited land, outspoken women who spoke up in church, midwives who used herbal remedies, or women who lived too independently were all disproportionately targeted. Salem's witch hunts, in many ways, became a campaign to silence women who threatened patriarchal order, punishing independence under the guise of rooting out evil. Perhaps the most unsettling element of the Salem trials was how they cultivated a culture built on betrayal. The judicial system at the time was twisted in such a way that confessing and implicating others offered the best chance of survival. This created a chain reaction, almost like a pyramid of accusations, where the only way to save yourself was to drag others down with you. The more names you supplied, the better your odds of escaping the noose. In this warped system, the entire community was reshaped into a web of informants and betrayers. The psychological torment extended beyond those formerly accused. Families and friends of the condemned found themselves trapped in impossible dilemmas. Imagine being the child of someone declared a witch. You could defend your parent and risk falling under suspicion yourself, or you could turn away and carry the lifelong guilt of abandonment. Many households fractured under the weight of such impossible choices. Sons and daughters testified against parents, siblings betrayed one another, and spouses left each other to preserve their own lives. A central weapon in this nightmare was the reliance on spectral evidence. This so-called proof came from dreams, visions, and supernatural claims accusations impossible to disprove. How could anyone defend themselves against the charge that their spirit had haunted someone asleep or inflicted invisible torments? The courtroom became a surreal, Kafkaesque trap where innocence could not be demonstrated because the rules of logic and evidence had been abandoned. The performances of the afflicted girls intensified this psychological warfare. Their shrieks, convulsions, and claims of unseen torture whenever the accused entered the room were powerful theater, carefully staged to maximize emotional impact. Even skeptics sometimes found themselves persuaded, overwhelmed by the sheer intensity of these spectacles. Girls had learned how to manipulate the fears and superstitions of their neighbors with chilling precision. The witch panic also fed on existing social anxieties. Salem was a community already weighed down by trauma. Recent native raids had left scars. Political instability created unease, and economic pressures made daily survival difficult. Instead of addressing these tangible problems, the trials offered a scapegoat: Satan and his supposed servants. In doing so, the community redirected its grief, anger, and confusion into persecution rather than solutions. The rapid spread of accusations shows just how swiftly a society can collapse into barbarism when fear is allowed to dominate. What began as a handful of charges soon ballooned into a frenzy engulfing hundreds. This escalation was not random, it was actively fueled by leaders who chose to amplify fear rather than contain it. The interrogations themselves relied on psychological torment. The accused were deprived of sleep, subjected to endless questioning, threatened with harm to their families, and offered leniency if they would only confess. These tactics were designed to erode mental defenses until even the innocent admitted to crimes they had never committed. Countless confessions extracted in this way were the direct product of coercion and despair. The trials also thrived because Salem was already divided. Long-standing quarrels over land boundaries, church authority, and social hierarchies meant neighbors carried deep resentments. The witch panic became a tool for one faction to crush another, all under the guise of serving God. Patterns in the accusations often aligned neatly with these pre-existing conflicts. Gender bias played an equally important role. Roughly 4 out of 5 of the accused were women, and the majority of accusers were female as well. In Puritan thought, women were considered especially vulnerable to temptation, more easily swayed by Satan, and more prone to sin. The witch trials amplified these prejudices, disproportionately targeting women who lived outside rigid expectations. Widows, outspoken church members, healers with knowledge of herbs, or simply women too independent for comfort. To fully understand Salem, we must also look beyond it. These events were not isolated but part of a larger wave of witch hunts imported from Europe, where tens of thousands had already been executed in the name of rooting out sorcery. Salem represented the most extreme New World manifestation of beliefs that had long plagued the Old World. The aftermath of the trials left devastation that endured 4 generations. Families were broken and never truly reconciled. The local economy collapsed as vital members of the community were killed or fled in fear. Trust among neighbors was shattered, leaving scars on the social fabric that were never fully repaired. What makes the Salem Witch Trials particularly haunting is not only the suffering they inflicted, but what they reveal about human nature. The accusers were not demons. They were ordinary villagers, swept up in a system that rewarded cruelty while punishing compassion. The judges were not villains from a storybook. They were respected leaders who allowed fear and bias to cloud their judgment. Most chilling of all, the Salem story demonstrates how quickly societies can abandon even their most cherished legal protections when fear takes hold. Principles such as due process, the presumption of innocence, and the right to counsel, cornerstones of justice, were discarded with alarming ease in the frenzy of hysteria. These fundamental protections of justice were discarded under the guise of battling an invisible enemy. Once those safeguards were stripped away, the descent into tyranny was rapid and devastating. The legacy of Salem did not end with their lives destroyed in the 1690s. It planted a model for how fear could be turned into a weapon against those deemed unpopular or vulnerable. It proved that mere accusations could annihilate reputations, fracture families, and unravel entire communities. This grim lesson would echo through American history time and again. From the Red Scare of the early 20th century to the hysteria of McCarthyism in the 1950s, and even modern moral panics, Salem was not an isolated tale of superstition. It was a case study in psychological manipulation, social control, and the deliberate dismantling of a community's moral framework. The witch trials remind us how swiftly civilization can unravel when fear is allowed to overpower reason, when prejudice outweighs justice, and when ordinary people become complicit in extraordinary cruelty. What makes Salem so frightening is not that it occurred in a supposedly primitive age more than 3 centuries ago. The true horror lies in how familiar the patterns still feel today. The forces that drove the trials' fears, the instinct to protect oneself at the expense of others, remain embedded in human nature. The Salem Witch Trials endure as a permanent warning of what happens when societies surrender their principles and give in to their darkest instincts. Studying Salem isn't simply about revisiting history. It's about recognizing the warning signs in our own time, when communities begin turning against their most vulnerable members, when accusations without evidence are treated as unquestionable truth, and when fear becomes a tool to justify the erosion of legal rights. We should remember Salem and ask ourselves whether we are watching the rise of a new kind of witch trial. The men and women who perished in Salem deserve to be remembered not as faceless statistics but as human beings. Parents, children who were betrayed by their own community. They were tortured, executed, and stripped of dignity by people who knew them, by magistrates who should have defended them, and by a system that prized conformity above truth. Their deaths were not unavoidable tragedies. They were the result of deliberate choices made by individuals who could have chosen differently. The trials ended not because justice suddenly prevailed, but because the hysteria finally touched the powerful. When accusations reached the governor's wife, and when influential ministers began to face the threat themselves, the authorities were forced to question the deadly system they had unleashed. This shift reveals the class-driven nature of the trials. As long as the powerless bore the brunt of the accusations, the machinery of persecution was allowed to grind on. Perhaps the most insidious feature of Salem was how it transformed everyday people into agents of persecution. The trials did not depend solely on a handful of zealous preachers or corrupt officials. They relied on the participation of the entire community. Social tensions that had simmered for years, disputes over land, inheritance, church leadership, or local rivalries, were suddenly reframed as evidence of sorcery. Consider how accusations followed clear lines of existing conflict. Property disagreements became framed as signs of supernatural malice. Business rivalries morphed into claims of devilish interference. A failed harvest or a broken contract could suddenly be blamed on the curse of a neighbor. The tragic case of Rebecca Nurse illustrates this dynamic with heartbreaking clarity. At 71, she was among the most respected members of Salem Village. Mired for her deep faith, her kindness, and her generosity. When she was accused of witchcraft, 39 of her neighbors risked their own safety to sign a petition vouching for her good character. Yet even that overwhelming support could not save her once the machinery of accusation began to turn. Her trial was rooted not in supernatural evidence, but in long-standing family feuds. The Nurse family had been embroiled in land disputes with the powerful Putnam clan for years. When the witch panic erupted, Thomas Putnam's 12-year-old daughter, Anne Putnam Jr., claimed that Rebecca Nurse's specter had tormented her. A mundane property disagreement was transformed into a cosmic battle between good and evil. What made this transformation so destructive was how it inverted traditional social relationships. In Puritan culture, age commanded respect, piety was revered, and community standing was a shield. But during the trials, these values collapsed. Young girls, servants, and the socially marginal suddenly held life and death power over their elders and superiors, simply by claiming to be victims of invisible assaults. This inversion was no accident. It reflected deeper tensions in Puritan society over authority, gender, and the rigid social order. Young women, often powerless in daily life, became the central figures in a system that rewarded their accusations and elevated their voices above all others. Suddenly, the youngest, and most overlooked members of Salem Village found themselves thrust into the center of attention. Their words alone could decide who lived and who died. Entire families could be ruined by nothing more than their accusations. For perhaps the first time in their lives, these girls wielded true influence, and some reveled in that newfound authority. Bedikikli. They mastered the art of performance collapsing into spasms at precisely the right moments, screaming out accusations when tensions in the courtroom reached their peak, and even insisting they saw ghostly figures invisible to everyone else. As the trials progressed, their displays grew increasingly dramatic and carefully coordinated, pointing to a calculated manipulation rather than mere outbreaks of uncontrollable religious hysteria. But these girls did not act in isolation. Behind them stood adults with their own motives, eager to encourage the accusations. Ministers like Samuel Parris used the trials to strengthen their hold over the community and silence rivals. Prominent families such as the Putnams seized the moment to settle bitter disputes and expand their estates. Even average townsfolk discovered that supporting the prosecutions offered both protection from suspicion and a chance to advance their standing. This created a vicious cycle. The more accusations flew, the greater the pressure on the accused to confess and name others. Those who insisted on their innocence almost always faced execution, while those who confessed no matter how fantastical their stories could sometimes buy themselves mercy. The system rewarded dishonesty and manufactured an ever-expanding web of supposed conspirators. Tituba, Reverend Parris's enslaved woman from Barbados, set this pattern early on. Faced with certain death if she denied the charges, she instead gave her interrogators exactly what they craved: details of witches' gatherings, demonic creatures, and elaborate plots against Salem. Her confession saved her life, but also provided the script that others would follow. Yet even confessions did not guarantee safety, for the trials had developed their own unstoppable momentum, powered by fear, greed, and the seductive allure of accusation. As suspicion widened, even the seemingly untouchable were not spared. When the governor's own wife was accused, William Phipps finally realized the chaos had spun far beyond control. The Salem tragedy laid bare how quickly a community can collapse into mass hysteria once fear overrides. Reason and institutions abandon their duty to protect the innocent. It showed how ordinary people could become participants in extraordinary cruelty, not through sudden corruption, but through countless small compromises that steadily eroded justice and humanity. Most chilling of all was how self-sustaining the persecution became. The trials generated their own fuel. Questioning the process was itself dangerous, and defending the accused invited suspicion. The only safe position was zealous support, which only deepened the frenzy. The true horror of Salem was not merely the deaths of innocents, but the way an entire society convinced itself that this slaughter was righteous. Murder became sanctified as holy duty. Paranoia was dressed up as piety, and mob violence masqueraded as divine justice. In doing so, Salem provided a template for persecution that echoed through history, from the witch hunts of Europe to the ideological purges of the modern age. Its legacy reminds us that this capacity for collective delusion lies dormant within every society, waiting only for the right mix of fear, authority, and opportunity to awaken it. The trials did not end because justice triumphed, but because the machinery of accusation finally threatened those with too much power to ignore. Politics, not morality, ended the madness. That is perhaps Salem's darkest lesson, that without constant vigilance and safeguards, any society, no matter how devout or civilized, can slide into the abyss. The witch trials were not an anomaly, but a revelation, exposing the shadow that forever lingers beneath the surface of human communities, waiting for its chance to rise. The Salem Witch Trials were not simply outbreaks of spontaneous mob rage. They were structured persecutions carried out through the very systems meant to uphold fairness and protect the innocent. The courts, the clergy, community authorities, and even ordinary citizens all played roles in a machinery of destruction that thrived on fear and gained strength with every new accusation. These events exposed just how swiftly the presumption of innocence could be discarded, how easily the burden of proof could be shifted onto the accused, and how readily a society could unite against its most fragile and defenseless members. At the heart of this phenomenon was psychological manipulation, offering unsettling insight into human vulnerability to mass hysteria. The accusers, many of them young women living within the confines of a rigidly patriarchal culture, suddenly discovered that their voices carried unprecedented influence. Through claims of spectral evidence and invisible torments, they could hold the attention of judges, preachers, and the entire village. Their convulsions and dramatic outbursts became staged performances, a grim theater where the most flamboyant accusations carried the greatest weight. This showed how fragile traditional social order could be once fear drowned out reason, allowing those once powerless to become destructive forces simply by making claims that no one could disprove. The underlying social and economic rifts in Salem magnified the hysteria. The village was already split by disputes over land boundaries, ministerial authority, and access to economic opportunities. Families who had quarreled for decades suddenly found the witch trials a convenient weapon for settling grudges. Long-standing property disagreements were recast as spiritual battles, where charges of witchcraft replaced legal arguments. The pattern of accusations mirrored these divisions. Many of the accused had histories of lawsuits, boundary feuds, or social conflicts with their accusers and their kin. Equally troubling was the way the trials amplified pre-existing prejudices against the marginalized, particularly women, the elderly, the poor, and social outsiders. Most of those accused were women, especially those who did not conform to Puritan expectations of female submission. Widows who controlled property, outspoken women who resisted authority, folk healers, or simply individuals who lived unconventionally were prime targets. In this way, the trials functioned as a brutal tool for enforcing conformity, using the death sentence as the ultimate means to silence dissent and punish those who defied accepted norms. The abandonment of long-established legal safeguards highlighted how swiftly centuries of legal evolution could be erased when a community succumbed to fear. The acceptance of spectral evidence, testimony about dreams, visions, and unseen spirits, was a stark rejection of rational standards of proof. Confessions obtained under duress, through intimidation, discomfort, or promises of mercy, were accepted as trustworthy despite their clear unreliability. Normal protections for defendants were dismantled piece by piece, replaced with a legal system designed not to discover truth but to confirm assumptions about supernatural evil. Community participation in the prosecutions also revealed the terrifying strength of collective action in amplifying individual biases. Neighbors who might have once kept private suspicions now had a platform to voice them under the guise of moral duty. Accusation became a public act of loyalty, a demonstration of one's own piety by identifying wickedness in others. This produced a snowball effect. Every accusation reinforced earlier ones, creating a self-sustaining narrative the village was determined to uphold, no matter how much suffering it caused. Adding to this moral collapse were stark financial incentives. The estates of the accused were seized to cover jail and trial expenses, creating an economic motive to keep the process alive. Accusers sometimes profited directly, inheriting property or removing rivals from competition. Officials such as the sheriff collected fees from arrests, imprisonments, and executions, further entrenching the machinery of persecution. With so many people benefiting, the trials dragged on even as doubts about their legitimacy began to grow. Perhaps most damning of all was the role of religious authority. Ministers who should have spoken for reason and compassion instead lent theological legitimacy to the terror. By interpreting scripture in a way that fueled the panic, they transformed their pulpits into platforms that sanctified fear, justifying cruelty in the name of faith and righteousness. The ministers of Salem framed the proceedings as nothing less than a cosmic war between divine light and infernal darkness. Their sermons and writings supplied a theological scaffolding that transformed doubt into sin. To question the legitimacy of the trials was portrayed as aligning oneself with the devil, making skepticism appear not just dangerous, but blasphemous. With this religious seal of approval, the hunt for witches acquired a sacred aura, convincing many that opposing it was equivalent to rejecting God himself. Yet the eventual collapse of the trials did not arise from some sudden surge of reason or compassion. Instead, it came slowly, as accusations began to reach to height, threatening the reputations and safety of people far too influential to be sacrificed. When the charges extended to the wives of ministers and the relatives of magistrates, the importance of due process and credible evidence suddenly reemerged. This selective rediscovery of justice exposed the deeply political nature of the crisis. The system protected power rather than challenging it, and those safeguards appeared only when elites themselves were endangered. In the aftermath, Salem was left with a heavy and contradictory legacy. Some of those involved eventually confessed their guilt, expressed remorse, or asked for forgiveness. But many more stayed silent, rationalized their conduct, or minimized the events as an unfortunate but understandable reaction to unusual circumstances. This mixture of acknowledgement and denial has echoed across history, resurfacing in later episodes of collective wrongdoing where societies have struggled to fully admit their culpability. The lessons drawn from Salem extend far beyond 17th century mess. They illustrate humanity's universal tendency to seek simplistic answers to complicated challenges, to assign blame to convenient scapegoats, and to exploit fear as a weapon for political and social gain. Salem's tragedy demonstrates how quickly, even a supposedly civilized community can abandon its own cherished ideals when faced with uncertainty, and how fragile the rule of law becomes. Once fear and prejudice replace fairness and evidence, the relevance to the modern world is uncomfortably clear. The same dynamics that fueled the witch panic fear of outsiders, the destructive power of unverified accusations, the temptation to suspend due process during crises, and the manipulation of genuine grievances for personal or political advantage remain alive today. Salem's story serves as a stark warning of how fragile the safeguards of liberty truly are, and how much vigilance is required to preserve them. Perhaps the most unsettling realization is that the trials were not the product of some uniquely superstitious, ignorant society. The people of Salem were not monsters or caricatures of religious zealotry. They were ordinary men and women, capable of kindness as well as cruelty, who allowed fear to erode their better judgment. Their participation in persecution reveals something profoundly human: the ease with which communities can descend into collective violence, and the difficulty of admitting that descent once it begins. The true terror of Salem lies not in stories of spells or demons, but in the very human processes that dismantled the bonds of trust and justice. The trials replaced compassion with cruelty, silenced dissent with death, and elevated fear above truth. They revealed how easily the moral fabric of a community could be torn apart during times of stress, and how difficult it is to rebuild once destroyed. 3 centuries later, it is tempting to dismiss Salem as a relic of a more primitive age, but to do so is to miss its enduring warning. The impulses that drove the trials: fear, prejudice, the search for certainty in uncertain times, and the appeal of belonging to a righteous cause still lie dormant in every society. The challenge for every generation is to recognize these forces early, and to resist them before they gain momentum and become unstoppable. The legacy of Salem is, at its core, a lesson in vigilance. Liberty and justice are not natural conditions. They are delicate human constructions that must be actively maintained and defended. The memory of Salem as victims reminds us that freedom requires not only protection from external threats, but also the courage to confront the darkness within our own communities and within ourselves. Those who died in Salem perished not just at the hands of executioners, but because their neighbors failed to uphold the standards of reason and morality that could have saved them. Their tragedy challenges us to do better, to remember their suffering, to guard against repetition, and to ensure their loss was not meaningless. In the end, the Salem Witch Trials stand as both a condemnation and a source of hope. They expose our capacity for cruelty, delusion, and injustice, but they also highlight the possibility of redemption and the eventual triumph of truth. The madness ended not because evil was vanquished outright, but because enough people found the courage to speak against the tide, to admit the community had lost its way, and to reclaim reason from fear. In that fragile victory lies the reminder that even in our darkest hours, conscience and compassion can prevail if we are willing to let them.